Tēnā tātou. Tūtahi kei te haere tonu ngā mihi kia tātou katoa. Kia koe apa nui mō o kupu hei whakaritea tō rātou rangi. Ai, tino pai te moi, kei te moi tonu ahau. All right, so thank you very much. I have quite a bit to say, so the niceties are going to be just shortened a little bit today. But I first of all want to just address the title of my talk. And you'll notice that there's different phrases in there which are important about what I want to say and how I want to position what I'm saying. So the first bit is ringaropa. And ringaropa refers to the metaphor of the blisters on the hands. It's a metaphor which signals that actually it's about the work, it's about doing it, and not so much about the kōrero pahu in behind, or the saying what we're going to do, but actually producing what we are talking about. So it's an enactment. So the next two words, few words, but enacting kaupapa Māori. So where I want to go today is to broaden the concept of kaupapa Māori as we've been using it, because in my view it's a very powerful concept which is underutilised in the way in which we're co-opting it to support our work. For the most part, people simply use kaupapa Māori as another meaning for the Māori perspective. And it's more than that. There is a whole transforming element that sits inside it that many, some of us in this room, have contributed to arguing and building out as a theory of transforming. And it's that part that I want to share with you, because I think it's a powerful intervention instrument that is still largely underutilised by many of us in the transforming work that we're taking on. And the last bit of that title is transforming praxis. Now, that praxis bit tends to, people go weak at the knees when they see a word like that. Yes, it's a flash Pākehā word, but it means something really important for us. So praxis is about understanding what's not working and reorganising it and doing it again. This continuous cycle of making things count, of making them work. So we don't just do something. The praxis cycle is a continuous improvement cycle. So all of these words together sort of encapsulate really where I want to go today. Now I need to just position myself a little bit at the beginning, because I do want to acknowledge all of you in the room. Every one of you is doing something in a very important area for Māori development. And often this work goes unnoticed because it's at the raru haki end often of our communities. And I just want to say that that we need to support each other and develop ways of working collectively and positively to work at this. It's not you guys as the front line, if you like, but it's everybody's concern. So I want to, again, say that I'm not an expert in the field of many of what you do. My area of expertise really is in education and in theorising and talking about educational change and transformation. And but I do want to acknowledge the hard work, the ringaropa of all of you in this room who are actually in the front line doing these important things for our communities. And many of you winning, that's the important part, and I'll come back to that, because we need to share those ideas and we need ways in which we can transfer our successes. All right, so let me... So obviously next doesn't work. Oh, kapai. Okay, so a key platform that I want to start from is that all of us, we can't keep doing the same old things that aren't working. And we need to understand that Māori suffer from, significant levels of, disproportionate levels of unequal social, economic and cultural pathologies, outcomes, inequities, whichever word we want to use. So as a Māori, kaupapa Māori practitioner, I work across three sort of domains in my work as in the academia and as a scholar, but as an activist as well. So not taking everything that I see for granted, but trying to challenge and to make change. And obviously really concerned about how we transform things. Just rip through this stuff. So I want to traverse a number of points today that I think are important for us to learn or to consider. I won't be so forward as to say we should learn, because many of you have got these things on board, but to consider reinforcing perhaps these things in the work that we do and the approach that we take. So the first thing, and we heard this in the conference earlier on, that colonisation is ongoing. All right, so I'll say it even more bluntly, colonisation hasn't gone away. In fact, it's simply changed shape and is coming at us in new formations. And we need new literacies to understand the new formations of colonisation, to unpack those so that we can respond accordingly. Because we all know the traditional methodologies, the schools did it to us, the churches did it to us, the policies did it to us, and some of those are still in place, but many of the new formations are bound up in the what we call the new neoliberal economic project, and in New Zealand its formation is a particular shape which comes out of the 1986 Roger Douglas reforms. And despite can I say the word denials, it is still present. It has not got the key elements of the neoliberal economic reforms of the 1980s haven't gone away. They've actually been reasserted. And I won't go into the detail, but things like te pukunga and the one-size-fits-all kaupapa that drives that can be traced back to a sophisticated rebirth of devolution, which was, in a sense, critically exposed early in the 1980s as being a bit of a failure for the way in which we are developing policy, and yet it's being resurfaced in disguise. So that idea of the new shapes of colonisation, we need to understand it, need to be able to unpack some of that stuff. The second point that I want to canvass today is the idea of self-development, and I'm going to track out the kaupapa Māori history and its development and where it came from, because a key element of its genesis was in the fact that it came out of Māori communities themselves. It was a self-development idea that was embedded inside kohanga reo and kura kaupapa Māori. And so the reason I want to revisit this is because I think when we hear people talking, as we have in the last 2 days, about the idea of the state versus what we're doing in our communities and so on, we need a way of speaking back to the state about what we're doing. We need to consolidate the theoretical base from which we're operating. And that theoretical base, in my view, is found in some of our most successful ideas. Kohanga reo is one of them. Key element, we did it ourselves. The answers are in our heads. And then others are bought into it. Of course, no surprise that on the floor of the United Nations, our government claimed a pat on the back for how they developed kohanga reo and kura and all sorts of things. So the idea here is, okay, might laugh a bit about the state doing that, but in the end, what's happened is that the state has come on board with our ideas. If they're good enough, the state needs to pick them up as well. Now, there's danger in the state picking them up as well, but at the same time, what I'm really saying is that the ideas travel well because they become more acceptable. All right, so the next one that I want to that I'm looking at today is the notion of what is evidence. Again, a question that's been traversed in this conference, because often evidence is used as a gatekeeping device over the top of our good ideas. So we line up and say, this is what we're doing on the ground, this is what seems to be working in our community context, this is going well, we need support. And the answer comes back, well, our evidence shows blah, 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 and where's your evidence? That kind of thing. So what I want to say about the whole notion of evidence is that the biggest or most significant evidence that we have is the ongoing crisis, despite government apparently, ostensibly, intervention. The crisis still exists. That's the evidence that's there. It's not working. So part of what we're talking about when we say we need to expand a sort of a kaupapa Māori perspective is the idea of how do we theorise what we're doing. Now, don't, but like praxis, don't go wobbly at the knees because I said theory. All right? Theory is simply logic. What's the logic for doing this? And we need, to understand the logic. I often tell the story about my cousin from Tolaga Bay, who was my parekura, my first cousin. When he went to school, they had to learn the times table, 3 times table. He went up the front, got pointed out, go up the front. Away he went. 3 1s are 3, 3 2s are 6, 3 3s are 3 4s are and before he could go much further, the teacher said, "Look, parekura, what do you think you're doing?" And as quick as a flash, he came back and said, "Look, sir, I might know the words, but I know the tune." And really, that's the point about theory, logic. Many of us know the words, but we don't know the tune sitting in behind it. And so that's what I want to suggest today is one of the important things that we need to attend to in the work to make it more effective. I've already said that I think everyone in this room is doing their bit, and large projects, small projects, but everyone's trying to do and make a difference. What I am saying is that we can do better, perhaps. This is this idea of how we might think about a praxis sort of model to the work that we do. The next one is, the validity of our indigenous experience, logic and theorising, and that's really how we make that stick, how we make it count in a contested area, really. And the contestation really comes out of the state formal policy domain, and whereas we're trying to argue back from the experience and the practical end of actually doing it. And there's often we're speaking past each other. How do we lock those things together? The next element that I'm sort of broaching is what I call whakaoho whānau. And the idea here is reawakening the power of our traditional whānau values. Right, now this is slightly different. And I do have a little bit of a critique of whānau ora on this basis, that whānau ora is not about just doing projects for the whānau. While, in some ways that at various times is important, a project on whakapapa or having a hui for some reason and so on. What the real intervention element for me in igniting the traditional whānau values is a long-term intervention. It's about how our traditional values of whānau around reciprocity, tuakana of our nurturing our elders, a whole lot of our responsibilities, which actually are a form of social capital. How do we ignite that in very real terms for a long-term intervention? In other words, without, again, getting overly romantic about whānau, because I know many of you are dealing with the other end of it and see some of the less romantic views of our whānau. But in the end, as an aspiration of where we might head, I think it's important that if we can revitalise the more traditional ways in which a whānau might operate and take responsibility for each other, look after each other, help to mediate the worst socio-economic excesses. Most of us as parents are doing that as a type of nuclear family, because the daughter rolls up and says, "Dad, can you give me," But yeah, so, and most of us are doing that, but I'm talking about a much broader intervention and I think that's where we need to aim. How do we stimulate that? And so my worry about whānau ora is that we've gone too much towards projects rather than looking at a long-term intervention that's potentially there. The next thing I want to sort of canvass, I'm doing a hell of a lot today, by the sound of things, is address the issue which Leonie keeps saying I was going to do. So I better do it, which is really argue that we've become overly concerned with culturalist intervention as opposed to structuralist intervention. Now, culturalist intervention is how we change people and how we change behaviours. And, of course, that's not the only game in town. I think Marama, the Minister, mentioned this the other day in the way she was positioning her kōrero, that the state is operating at different levels, a lot of structures that are also that also need to be engaged with and exposed as being deficient, how they can be improved, if at all they are needed. And so I just want to draw attention to a better balance between looking at changing ourselves and changing people, and it's all about, racism to me is just one element of a very narrow sort of analysis. We need to see in behind some of the structures that are driving that. All right, hello, Morna. So that last point really is about balance. So in our work, I want to, I think all of us need to be, and indeed the conference title pointed out, it said prevention and intervention. And I think that the balance between building fences at the top of the cliff and doing ambulance work at the bottom, we need to think consciously about how we do both ends of this. All right, and many of us are caught in doing the ambulance stuff, and we don't get the joy of actually doing some of the preventative stuff, which is important. And so it's really about balance in the way in which we work, and to, I think, bring a better shape to what we're doing as a community. All right, that's what I said I was going to do. Now I'm going to do something different. So just to, again, positioning myself, I'm really conscious of, as an educator, speaking to this group who are specialists in a particular sets of fields, and so I want to own up to what I do and what I can't do. But so a lot of my work has been around theory, indigenous theorising, Māori theorising. And my theory work is informed by my practice, right? I'm not talking about theory that I read in books and studied and so on. It's theory that's come out of the practical manifestations of what I've done on the ground, practical projects, and I'll illuminate that in a minute. And to that extent, my credibility is to be seen in the blisters on my hands. Right? It's not in really my pahu words and all of that. It's have a look, that my thing is look at what I've done and then criticise me from there. So I position myself within my work. And for those of you who are doing research, we're often called to write in the third person, write objectively, and so on. My approach with my students is you must own your words right from within your kaupapa. Own up. Our communities, the validity of what we say, our communities are reading it from the point of view of, do you own your words, or somehow it's over there, something in the distance. So these are just sort of little techniques about, I think, positioning our work when we're being confident about putting ourselves at the centre of what we do and why. So my relatives expect me to own my words, not to pretend that somehow I'm objective and over there. I'm from my community. I'm from my iwi. I own up. I'm happy to do that. You can hang me if you like, but I don't care. My iwi will hang me first. So again, just positioning. So I came through at a time in university, the 1960s. I'm a baby boomer, so get that out of your heads now. I'm a baby boomer. And so I came through when the civil rights movements, when Marama's dad was being a dissident, and we were trying to control him. Ngā Tamatoa, the women's movements, Black Power, the Polynesian Panthers were part of our Māori club at the University of Auckland at that time. Various protests and so on. I mentioned this background because it's very important in terms of how it shaped the way I think. It's developed my consciousness, my political outlook. This should have come a bit earlier. This is again still about positioning, but I want to say that the ideas that I've been involved in, the work that I do, it's not done by myself. I do it with lots of other people. I'm just lucky that I'm the one who's out front often doing talking, but it's been built on the back of other people's hard work as well. And that I like this slide because I put on it, I do not dance alone. And my daughter said, God, if you're going to dance like that, you will be. But this is really connects me. So Cheryl outlined our Whanganui side. This connects me to my name, Hingangaroa, which is from Tolaga Bay, and Te Rāwhioro Marae, Wānanga. Those of you who know that marae, that's my dad's side. So along the way, I've talked about my early stuff at the University of Auckland and so on, but I've grown. And I've sort of broken this down into 4 journeys where I've changed. So I've had all of this political experience at university and annoying people, in these different marches, etc. And that, over time, has developed a consciousness, a conscientisation, political conscientisation in my head. So that's one journey I've had that's informing the way I'm speaking. And then, once I've become conscientised to all these political nuances, I've moved from just being conscientised to how do I make a difference? How do I move to transforming? So that's another journey I've had to think about and to figure out in my work about what's important. And then a further journey inside this is how do you move from what I think Freire is called, before you can free others, you first have to free yourself. You need to have your own head right before you start talking to others about how they should get their heads right. So that question there, or that journey, is really from my own individual conscience to how I mobilise collectively with others of like mind. So that collective consciousness, how we start a social movement for change. In many ways, experience in kura, in kohanga, different communities, was about this journey of how we mobilised ourselves as a collective. I remember in the early days, we sort of took for granted, because the key element of the kura kaupapa movement, as we were talking about it in those early days, was the whānau. So I remember Tuki Nepe, and I want to, just as a quick aside, acknowledge Tanya from the other day, the comments made about Tanya, because it really reminded me of Tuki Nepe. Same sort of thing. Ringa Raupā just went out there and did it, and did all these changes in the kura kaupapa Māori movement in Auckland in its beginning. So just acknowledging Tuki and people like Tanya. I remember Tuki saying to everybody, we'll just, it's all about whānau. So we had our first whānau meeting. It was all over the place. God, it was just, and then we sort of twigged that actually we had a lot of, urban families who actually didn't know what we were expecting from the notion of whānau. So we ended up holding a sort of a series of whānau where we had everyone staying together in the same place and retaught our expectation of what a whānau is and how we wanted to operate and the commitment that's required from everybody to the collective. So just an aside there, really. So we ended up having to teach some of this stuff, reteach it. All right, so I'm just going to, please don't panic, I'm just going to zip through this. I usually show these because this was part of the proving my right to say things about certain things. Anyway, so just really, I've done things. This is really what this is about. So just flick through that. I would say that ngā pai o te maramatanga was an important development. It came off the floor of my office, and not many people know this, but the University of Auckland did not sponsor us. They sponsored 3 entities in a competition for 5 cores, and of course they went for the marine science, and they didn't conceptualise a Māori core. We put it up in the end. We argued it through and got 3+1 went forward from Auckland, and in the first round we were in the top 3. And so ngā pai o te maramatanga is still around today as a research entity. Sorry, I'm just... My doctoral program, just to explain a little bit about that. So just said we want 500 Māoris PhDs in 5 years. Now, having a doctorate is not the be-all and end-all. Let me say that straight away, because we've got some ning-nongs who also got doctorates. but it's a site of struggle. You know, it was where we thought we needed to build up. And so we set out a program to build 500 Māori PhDs in 5 years. If you understand that the year that I went through and Linda went through, we're probably 1 of 2 for the whole country that year. That's how slow it is. Now we're up to at least 50 to 60 per year going through. So it's just a side of struggle, side of change, and it's just one side. It's not what we're looking at, possibly. And then I was fortunate enough to be overseas for 8 years, and a lot of that work was with indigenous communities, ministers in other countries working for the Universitas 21. Before I came back, to Awanuiarangi, and again for another 8 years before I got crook. All right, and so there's the message again about colonisation. Just go down. So the key thing about understanding that colonisation is coming at us in multiple forms and in multiple ways is that our resistances have to be positioned the same. Right? So I often use the analogy of the boy at the dam, you know, trying to block all the water coming through the different holes. And you've only got so many fingers and toes. So what the implication of this is that we need everybody. We need all of our hands. So I'm not interested in the divide and rule amongst and building hierarchies in our struggle, that somehow this struggle is more important than this one. We need everybody. And some are doing their very best with doing a little struggle, but because that's all they can do. And they're giving it 100%. Others have got more opportunity, and they need to be doing the same. So we need ways, and this again is the theoretical positioning of our mindset, of ways of talking about our collectivity and struggle, that we're all in it. And I've sort of, over time, I'll come back to that, have talked about how we do that. All right, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Here Aroha, can you give me timing? Just tell me when it's...
You've got 20 minutes, that's including questions.
Including questions, okay, good. That's 2 hours.
Okay, you want to flight.
All right, so again, so when I went to school, we went to school to carve our names on our desks, basically to wreck schools, because schools didn't mean anything to us. And this is in the 1960s. And it was sort of very, technocratical, you just went to school, you hung your bag on the hook, sat at your own desk, put your arm around your own work, developed googly eyes to get the answers, and all that. So schooling wasn't a very pleasant experience where I was brought up. Very Pākehā. You left your Māori, as Donna Awatere has said, it's got a big sign, invisible sign over the gate of the school, Māori's not welcome. And so it was an awful experience in the 60s. Explanations for Māori underdevelopment at that time was, blame the Māoris, deficit theory. There's something wrong with your language, there's something wrong with the size of your families, something wrong with your culture, there's something wrong with the fact that you only get poor jobs working in the freezing work, shearing gangs and so on. And all of this was couched as a cumulative cycle of deprivation. And that was the taken for granted explanation of why Māori were on the margins at school. Then a bit later on, and even still today, we use this as a lot of the theorising, and I think it creeps into the work that we do. So just as I'm saying this so that we can have a critical reflection about this, but this is self-esteem theory. If we name a department, with a Māori name, or we do a little bit of Māori cultural additive stuff, that this will make it very friendly for Māori, and Māori will come in. But in schools we did this. We put down a hanggai, once a year. We went to visit the Māoris in the museum. We hung a few pictures on the wall, said kia ora every morning to the kids. And all of this stuff is the sort of cultural bits and pieces. But when you ask the structural question, well, what learning? And all of this stuff is just done to facilitate the same old learning to go down. All right? It didn't change what was being learned. It was really... And so the challenge was a little bit more profound that came along with kohanga. So I'm going to zip through some of these, and apologise if people have heard me track this story out. But it's a really important story because it's the foundation of the kaupapa Māori depth that we need to find in the work that we do. So we know kara, actually, and we need to credit kara with more steerage than people actually give him credit for. Everyone says, the idea dropped magically out of the sky to the Kaumātua conference and that story. But my research actually showed that kara actually steered that development because he had wised up his cultural officers who'd spread themselves around the conference and helped seed that. Anyway, kohanga, beautiful. Then we started, these kids turned 5 in Auckland, had nowhere to go because the state didn't have any responses. Waititi developed their own school for their own kohanga. Ruamata and Rotorua, same thing. Developed the school for their own kura, for their own kohanga. But for the general population, there was no kura. And that's where Tuki and others and Linda and I were involved with developing a schooling type. We were arguing that the state needed to build a distinctive schooling type called kura kaupapa Māori. Peter and Kathy and the others came aboard, and that became a national movement. And the idea was, how do we change the system to develop a kura kaupapa Māori schooling option for these kids who had the reo? Because we tried sending them to bilingual units and so on, and it did not work for them. Here, evidence again, another picture of evidence. The ministry said, well, what's your evidence? So we had to get the Waitangi Tribunal, as it was at that time, to come in, sit in and talk to our kids, and we produced our own evidence to speak back to them. Wrote out, developed our own resources, went to Parliament to change the Act, which we did, developed Katarina Matara and others, developed the our own teacher education program. Oh, and actually, probably most important, the development in that middle picture at the bottom of Te Aho Matua. So again, that was about an evidence argument. Ministry said to us, well, why are these schools different? We said, because it has a different educational philosophy. And they said, what is it? And we said, hold that thought, we'll be back next week. and we went away and it was done over a week at Raglan, at Heikoko's house. Now, so where I want to get to with this little kōrero was that the revolution of the 1980s wasn't the wonderful kohanga and the wonderful kura. And I have to say, actually, the heroes in that story are the parents of those kids who took a risk and gave their kids to us to teach. That was they were the heroes in that, and so the real revolution, in my view, that occurred wasn't so much the wonderful kura, and there were many of them, and wonderful kohanga and the nannies and so on who put the commitment into those. The real revolution that impacts our people at that time and should impact us now is a revolution up here, about this long. A change of mindset, a shift away of waiting for others to do things for us, to having the confidence and the courage to do things for ourselves, to trust in our experience, to trust in our cultural nuance, that our ancestors and our people did have answers, did have ways to do some of these interventions and so on. And so I think that is a key point that we should learn from what I call the revolution. The revolution was a revolution of thinking, a revolution of the mind. So last point I'm going to finish here in an hour. The last point I'll make is that, so where my research came in, I did my PhD research on kaupapa Māori, and what I was trying to discover was that I interviewed a whole lot of parents in kura and kohanga, and I asked them one question: why did you commit and take the risk to this alternative education? And they gave me all these answers. Then I aggregated all these answers and I came up with 6 key things that kept coming through. And these were self-determination. They wanted more control over the education of their children. Cultural aspirations. They still wanted to be Māori. They still wanted the Māori language, knowledge and culture to be part of their kids' lives. They wanted to see the kids to see themselves in the school when they got there, not walk into a totally different Pākehā environment. And they wanted their teachers to understand their kids. They wanted and they said this in this way: I don't want my child to be a freezing worker. I want something better. And I don't want my kid to simply go to the forestry with the others. And so there was a whole heap of things that were around wanting a different sort of socio-economic condition for their family and their well-being. And it's got quite a sophisticated sort of analysis around that socio-economic intervention, to the point where we could show that operating as a whānau intervened in a lot of the socio-economic debilitation that faced our families. When the kids go on the school trip and these ones here didn't pay, kei te pai, everyone goes on the trip. We find the money. When some kids come to school got no kai, kei te pai, all the kai's going in the middle anyway. Tuakana teina. When some kids are not getting it, the older kids are helping them to grasp new ideas. Whole lot of other things. This is about extended whānau, about our cooperative values and so on. And so whānau and whakawhanaungatanga become very important in the intervention process. And the collective vision, which was kaupapa Māori, they all believed that it was great to have a vision which everyone coalesced around. I'm not going to unlock this stuff for you other than to say, oh yes, I need to, because I made this point. This is the point about our collectivity. So this representation here is how we understand transformation normally. And actually, Marama, you got onto this actually on the other, when you spoke. But often we see transformation as a linear, you do this, you become conscientised, you get an idea, and that idea starts to annoy you to the point where you start to resist, and then you do something about it. A to B to C. And normally we see transforming as just simply that, as a straight line. But when you do that, it creates a linear formation. It creates a hierarchy, because you can't do transformation in that model without first doing conscientisation or resistance. So it's a very narrow model, not absolutely out of the picture, but for the most part is inadequate, if I could put it that way. What we found was that if you arrange these in a circular, what I call circular praxis, you put these A, B, C in a circle, put arrows going both ways. Now, what I can say is that I can plot every Māori in New Zealand somewhere on that diagram. Some are standing still, some are going forward, some are even going backwards. But I want to be able to talk inclusively. Our struggle is important to understand collectively. Because if we create linear structures, there's potential for divide and rule. So it's a really important point. Then the next extension of this theorising, and I'm just underplaying it, I'm just giving a general picture of it, is what I call incremental advancement. Because often, the big picture, a lot of people have got in mind, for example, in the 1960s, the feminist movement, or, people were asking the question, well, we've done all this protesting, when do we get there? And the answer is that, God, they get hoha waiting to get there and they fall off the struggle. So the important point about this in terms of transforming struggle is that we need to renew the struggle, often. And so, and kohanga is a good example where we need to, in my view, we haven't renewed that struggle. It's becoming domesticated because the state is reaching out and putting all these conditions and so on and domesticating the radical potential that's inside that movement. So it's just the, understanding that actually that's one thing that we need to, our new ideas that we're coming up with, we need to renew them. So, I'm looking at Tanya's work and she's jumping from here to here, doing other things, keeping it moving, doing other things. Really important. I'm sorry I'm not going to do all of that. So it just gives you a bit of an idea. Last thing, 1 minute.
Yeah, 1 minute.
So out of this, I went away overseas, as you know, and then I came back and I found that a lot of people were using kaupapa Māori exactly as I described it earlier. Kaupapa Māori was just used to say from the Māori perspective. And people didn't really understanding a deeper sort of theoretical potential that's inside that concept to engage in deeper transformational outcomes. So as a consequence of being annoyed and after seeing lots of things overseas, so also now being informed by a lot of indigenous contexts, over 14 countries overseas, looking at what people were doing and how they were experiencing their lives. I came back and said, here's a set of 5, I call them tests, for the veracity or for the effectiveness of a kaupapa Māori approach. So I'm just going to rattle them off. You're going to, unfortunately, there's no reading on this, as I've already said, I'm a pahu man, not a writer, no. But positionality. We need to understand where we're coming from, our strengths and our weaknesses as the voice. We need to position ourselves with our people, not outside, not over the top. Criticality. We need a critical way of understanding what is happening to us. So I use a lot of Pākehā theorists here, and I co-opt ideas. Frere, first free yourself before you can free others. Bourdieu talks about the reproduction of schooling, the cultural reproduction of it. Dominant groups reproduce themselves in their own image. You need to understand a few of these things. They're just tools to help us unlock and see the world more clearly. Structuralist and culturalist considerations that we need to be not just identifying what we can do as people in changing behaviours, but also identifying the blockages in the systems and the structures which go to things like economics, ideology, critical elements. Praxicality, that we need to be involved in this constant renewal. Understand what's not working, redo it, or reinvent it. Again, this praxicality is sort of going against the idea of this domestication cycle, where the state and dominant interests reach out to domesticate the radical potential of our transforming movement. And finally, transformability. Always ask the question, what changes as a result of what I'm doing? What changes for the better for our communities? Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou. After that great presentation, we get a time for one question. Ka pai? He pātai?
Morena tātou. Mai hea tuki a koe mātua for your presentation and kōrero this morning. I probably should posit that I am the pauarehe of the Whānau Commissioning Agency here in Te Waipainamu. Te koetahitanga o Te Waipainamu. But I also wanted to not necessarily argue but contend that those we do commissioning slightly differently in the South Island. Yes, of course, we have to do the standard response in terms of those systemic patriarchal foundations that were discussed yesterday. I mean, that's the reporting that we do for the funder. But we also have a space, a different space, a commissioning space where we allow whānau to realise their dreams and aspirations, and whatever that might look like for them, right down to the reporting, because that reporting is about their dreams and what they want to see and where they want to see it going into the future. So I wonder if in terms of, and I'm just going back to your notes, those intervention elements that you talk about, self-determination, cultural aspirations, mediation of social economic ingredients, if those dreams and aspirations help to address those, then surely that's a good thing. Because if it opens the door for some, or strengthens their cultural connections, those elements that you were talking about previously, and for some it might be their first step into Te Ao Māori, then I would argue that for those whānau, that actually is a good thing, some of those projects that you talked about or just mentioned in your kōrero. I just wondered if you had a comment.
Yeah, no, ka pai, keep going. If you're happy with what you're achieving, then ka pai. All I'm doing is seeding other possibilities potentially in what we do. And part of that is a praxis reflection for you guys. I'm sort of well aware of the contracting system, as it emanates from Auckland, West Auckland, I should say. But again, not all projects. I made that claim that the projects are sometimes just projects, and they don't have that long-term intervention element, which is what I was arguing. What is sustainable after the money's gone, after the money from the project? What's left behind? And I think that's just something you might ask over the top of your projects now, as a way of moving forward. But, kia kaha, you're doing your bit. Everyone's doing their bit. I'm not undermining that in what we're doing today. I just want to acknowledge again, hard work. Te iti me te rahi.